All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. I want to thank you all for being here today. Welcome to this Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center and America Walks webinar. Today, we are talking all about sidewalk inventories and how these tools, this process, and these data that we gather can be used for improving equity, ADA compliance, improving our overall walking networks and transportation networks. So we're delighted to have you here with us to talk about this topic today. We have a number of panelists joining us, and I want to take a moment and introduce you to them and share a little bit about their backgrounds. First, you'll hear shortly from Louise Lockett, who serves as a board member for America Walks, who's co-sponsoring this webinar. We'll hear from Louise in just a moment. Glad to have her here. Dr. Catherine, or Kate Kraft, is a nationally recognized expert on the impact of the built environment on health outcomes. She's the immediate past executive director of America Walks and was the founding director of the Everybody Walk Collaborative at America Walks. So thanks for being here with us, Kate. Dr. Andrew Dannenberg is here with us as well. Dr. Dannenberg is an affiliate professor in environmental health and in urban planning at the University of Washington in Seattle, where he teaches courses related to public health and the built environment. Previously, he led the Healthy Community Design Initiative at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. Aaron Cahan graduated with a Master of Public Administration from the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Policy in June 2022. Starting in the spring of 2021, Aaron partnered with Andrew Dannenberg and Catherine Kraft to study the different methods for conducting sidewalk inventories and their relative merits. In addition to continuing this research project, Aaron now works as an energy policy advisor with the Washington State Utilities and Transportation Commission. We're also joined by Colin Alexander, who is a senior transportation planner at the Birmingham, Alabama Department of Transportation, where he manages the department's capital projects, intergovernmental and interdepartmental partnerships, railroad coordination, transportation grant planning, and advising on transportation policy reform. We're glad to have Colin with us. And then finally, we're joined by Mark Hallenbeck, who's the director of the Washington State Transportation Center, TRAC, at the University of Washington. Mark has been with TRAC for 39 years, and much of his research involves the collection, use, summarization, and reporting of data that describe transportation system use and performance. He frequently teaches urban transportation planning and sustainable transportation in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. So quite the panel. We're excited to get them involved and hear what they have to say. We are going to have a little bit of housekeeping first. Attendees, you won't be able to speak during the webinar, but you do have the ability to submit questions to us. We encourage you to do that. We got so many of your great questions during the registration process, and we're holding about 20-25 minutes or so at the end for questions and handling those. So please send those in when you have them. You'll be able to access an archive of the webinar, both the slides that are already posted as well as a recording, which will be posted tomorrow morning. I'll share the link to that momentarily, and you'll get a follow-up email later today with all that information, including a link to where you can share some feedback with us following the webinar. If you share that feedback with us, you'll have a link to generate a certificate of attendance. Speaking of attendance, PDHs, things like that, we have been approved for 1 CM credit from the American Institute of Certified Planners. So if you're a planner, you know where to go to find that information and log those hours. We encourage you, as always, to review our previous sessions and check out what we've got coming up. We'll have another webinar next week on youth engagement in the transportation planning process and design process. So we hope you'll stick around for that one. I want to now, before we get into the presentations themselves, turn it over to Louise Lockett to say a bit more about the America Walks work and the co-sponsorship of this webinar.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. And hello to everybody out there. I'm on the board for America Walks and professionally the former Bike Walk RVA program director for sports backers in Richmond, Virginia, and presently serving as the epidemiologist lead for Richmond and Henrico Health Districts. So very excited to be here on behalf of America Walks. We are the leading national nonprofit that advances safe, equitable, accessible, and enjoyable places to walk and move by giving people and communities the resources to effectively advocate for change. We're committed to advancing walkability and mobility at all levels through national campaigns like our Safer Vehicles for Pedestrians and Reconnecting Communities, and at local and state levels by supporting community change grants and by training up great advocates through our Walking Colleges program. At America Walks, we know that ensuring safe, connected pathways for walking and rolling is a vital component of healthy people, strong transportation networks, and thriving communities. So I'm really excited to be here co-hosting along with BPIC, and just looking forward to a really enlightening discussion. So back over to you all.
Thanks, Louise. We'll have Louise join us back. She and I will collaborate on our Q&A portion later today. So we'll be looking at your questions as they come in, and we'll speak to you again in just a moment. For now, though, let me turn the floor over to, I'll stop sharing my screens so that they can share their screens. Dr. Andrew Dannenberg and Aaron Cahan will get things started for us. So please take it away, gentlemen.
Okay. I want to give just a little bit of a broad background of where we're headed, and then I will be turning it over to Aaron. Kate and I have worked for many years on the links between health and built environment. Part of the background is that from the public health point of view, we want to encourage people to be physically active, but realize that public health doesn't build sidewalks, trails, or places to be active. So we've learned over the years to work with the engineers and planners and developers and architects and public works departments and others who actually build the sidewalks. As we were looking at the idea of where are sidewalks and how do you get sidewalks, we realized that you need to know where they are before they can be built and prioritized. And so we were talking about that in the class I teach on health and built environment. Aaron was a public policy student at the time in that class and volunteered to work with us. And so he has done a superb job of pulling together information that you'll see him present today. As brief background, having networks of sidewalks, very important for the economy, for health and the environment, but there are relatively few sidewalk inventories that have been done or reports describing the kinds of methods, uses, and costs associated with them. Some of the research being done looks at the technologies for collecting it, but doesn't get into that broader set of issues of how and where are they being used and what are the best ways to do it. So with that, let me turn it over to Aaron with the actual work we did. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. So again, I'm Aaron. And so the research questions that this background and that this process produced are, what are some of the best practices for conducting a sidewalk inventory? Why are inventories conducted and how are they used? What methods produce the most complete and accurate inventories? And what are the costs associated with them? To ensure that we were kind of comparing apples to apples, oranges to oranges, we came up with a few kind of definitions. The first is a basic inventory, and that's just you go around and you identify whether or not there is a sidewalk there. Then a condition assessment takes a step further, and you're not just identifying where there is sidewalk, but you're actually looking at the quality of each segment, how damaged it is, how accessible it is, etc. And then finally, a complete sidewalk inventory really identifies with the field inspection each segment of the sidewalk for quality. So it's a condition assessment with actual people on the ground going to each segment. Now, in order to kind of conduct this research, we had a few methods. First was literature review that was really trying to identify what research is already out there, what inventories people are conducting, how they're conducting them, which again really found that a lot of the focus has been on what available technology there is in new and emerging technologies, rather than in the actual methodologies for conducting and then using these inventories. We did some internet searching using various geographical filters in order to try to identify what information there was actually out there on the inventories that's publicly available. And we found about 120 across the country, ranging from large to small cities. And we selected from there, doing a kind of a geographic and size filter in order to come up with about 21 cities that were representative, again, of the geographic and population densities across the US. And then finally, we conducted some informative key interviews with public works departments in these 21 cities in order to actually understand how they were really doing this, what they're using it for, the costs and the challenges. Now, this is a map that kind of shows this selection, and again, the broad range of cities. We've got large cities like Seattle and Philadelphia. We've also got a lot of smaller, we've got some smaller cities like Republic, Missouri, or Lee Summit. And so this, again, really gives you an idea that we selected for our diversity in geography and population size. Now, some of the methods that we found were, ranging from things like the mobile LiDAR, which, as you can see, is effectively either a Segway or a small motorized device that has a LiDAR machine on it that sends out signals to measure each piece of the sidewalk that it rolls over. You have people, as you can see in the bottom left, using an app, whether that's Esri or some other kind of locally designed app, to actually go out and measure sidewalks and collect it that way. Some places have actually just used satellite or GIS data to base their maps off of. And other places, similar to app-based collection, instead of using a digital app, they use a paper form that is generated locally. And so when looking at these different practices, we kind of came up with 3 categories for comparison: the accuracy, the labor intensity, and the time requirement. Now, three asterisks means a greater amount of this, with 1 being less. And so we found that the most accurate is going to either be field observers walking with a segment with tablets, just it's easier to collect with a digital tool, or field observers using a Segway or some other vehicle with LiDAR attached to it. Now, these are both the most accurate, but as you can see, the field workers is going to be a bit more labor intensive and thus a higher time requirement, while LiDAR is less labor intensive and less time requirement with just as much accuracy. The main caveat with the LiDAR is that, as many of you I'm sure are aware, it can be rather expensive to access. The next rank of accuracy was using GIS and satellite data for what areas they had kind of that data for, and then substituting in some field observer work to kind of supplement that. And that has less accuracy just because when you're using satellite data, trees obstruct sidewalks, cars, if they did say a Google Street View, are going to obstruct the view of the sidewalks. And without the people actually there measuring, it's much harder to assess the condition. And that's why the accuracy is less, but there is still some, fair amount of accuracy, labor intensity, and time requirement. And then the last 2 are, a GIS satellite data without field observers. And again, for the reasons I've just said, this can be challenging in terms of accuracy, but it is a lot less labor intensive and requires a lot less time. And then same with sampling existing sidewalk networks. Apologies that this appears to be in the way. And so what some places have done is that they will look at the existing sidewalk data and sample from it to then try to establish what the network looks like across the city, which is not very accurate, but also, again, doesn't take a lot of time and a lot of resources. So that being said, we then look at what is the actual value of these resources, of these networks, of these inventories. And really, they are critical for equitable sidewalk networks, both the construction and the maintenance. A lot of cities have previously relied on 311 calls where someone calls and complains and they come out and they fix it. And networks allow for that to be replaced by providing objective data on where sidewalks are and what condition they're in. And again, with that in mind, they are really necessary to identify gaps in the networks and meeting ADA compliance about how wide your sidewalks are, about whether or not, what quality they are, whether or not they're accessible, and meeting those various ADA standards. And then finally, it also really facilitates active transportation to access services by making communities more accessible for those who are less physically able, or those who may not have a car or may not want to use a car. Now, one of the barriers that we found that are at least positive was costs. And we actually found that there is a pretty significant range between about 86 and 826 per miles of road in the 6 cities that actually provided data for this. Now, this depends a lot on, are you doing an inventory or a condition assessment? Are you doing this in-house, or are you hiring a third-party contractor? Those tend to really focus in on where those cost variations come from. Also, partially depends on a little bit of the size of your city and, again, the resources you have available. But what we did find is that pretty much across the board, these inventory costs didn't exceed 1% of the budget for the department responsible for sidewalks. And then again, based off of the inventory type, the technology used, the labor available, and the sidewalks covered, that all contributes to this pretty wide range in costs. And then to really reiterate this point, the sidewalk inventories are really critical for ADA compliance. The ADA is really the primary impetus for conducting these inventories, and thus you need some political will to kind of actually get them on the ground. But concern over ADA ADA lawsuits and the vulnerability of cities that aren't compliant has always been a really big motivator and has often helped advocates push their local priorities to really focus on sidewalks, as again, local priorities and political will are often determined by municipal leaders. Now, finally getting to kind of the next steps would be developing a practical guide to help advocates and city agencies conduct sidewalk inventories. And to this note, all of the questions that you're submitting, unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them, but they will inform what we're actually including in this practical guide that we're going to set out for distribution. And then another next step would really be able to develop better estimates of costs and benefits for sidewalk inventories. And then finally, one of the ultimate goals is being able to document the incremental health benefits obtained for each additional investment in both sidewalk repair and construction. This will be in the chat as well, but you can read the manuscript in its preprint form there. And then Andy, myself, and Kate are all available via email to kind of answer questions and engage further. And then I can also drop this in the chat, the websites for America Walks and PBIC, who again are hosting this and have a lot of really valuable resources. And that's the end of that. And I look forward to your questions later on in this webinar.
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron. Thank you, Dr. Dannenberg, for that presentation. I did drop the link to the research paper into the chat. Hopefully you saw that. We'll try to send it out again. A lot of great detail there that you can learn more. And we got some questions that we'll come back to Aaron and that team for to clarify some of the research and what they learned. So, but for now, Colin Alexander, Birmingham Department of Transportation. Let's go ahead and cue your presentation up. Go ahead and share your screen when you're ready. And the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. And good afternoon, everybody. Let me get this presentation started here. So as Dan said, I work as a senior planner for the city of Birmingham, Alabama. So we'll be going through some of our inventory efforts and the challenges related to those efforts. For a quick summary, for those of you who don't know much about Birmingham, Birmingham is the fourth largest city now in the state of Alabama, but it is the center of the largest metropolitan area in the state of about 1.1 million. City was founded in 1871 when two railroads crossed that in an area where coal, iron ore, and limestone are all found within 50 miles. So it became a big steel boom town. Its nickname is the Magic City because its population doubled in the last decade of the 19th century. And it continued to grow into the middle of the 20th century quite substantially. This has led to what I refer to as big city infrastructure issues. The city has approximately 1,000 miles of sidewalk that have been constructed. And like most cities over the last several decades, we've deferred a lot of that maintenance, which has led to a $200 million estimate in deferred maintenance in sidewalks alone for the city of Birmingham. But we have smaller city dynamics. As I said, we are the fourth largest city in the state now. In 1960, we had a population of about 350,000. We were slightly larger than the city of Atlanta. And over the last 50, 60 years, that population has dwindled to an approximate population of about 200,000 now in 2023. Population loss like that, combined with the large spread out infrastructure that we're continuing to maintain, puts a strain on our city finances. And so, for instance, our fiscal year 24 sidewalk budget is $250,000. That's a drop in the bucket compared to the estimated deferred maintenance, and it creates a big challenge in terms of how do you prioritize and manage that amount of asset. There's also the issue that many cities have, which is about, is this a public or a private responsibility? The City of Birmingham Code dictates that sidewalks are the responsibility of the private property owner. In reality, however, the city is almost entirely in an area of persistent poverty. We have a large population below the poverty level, and we have a lot of properties now that are vacant. Identifying property ownership is challenging, and so the city gets pulled into maintaining this property, which undercuts this is a private responsibility according to the city code. So this is why inventories are important for a city like Birmingham. We really need an inventory to understand the scale of what we have, both in terms of infrastructure and its rate of deterioration. And that inventory, in order to be successful, however, needs to lead to an action plan, identify how can we use our limited funds, because otherwise we spend all of this money on an inventory and nothing gets done because we have such limited funds to actually address the problem. And that's also needs to be backed up with a commitment from the city to deliver on that plan. deliver in terms of funding, and deliver in terms of this is our priority commitments. So past efforts in the city of Birmingham. Before 2015, we, like Aaron was talking about with other cities, our sidewalk repairs were prioritized by 311 complaints or field inspections. And it was sort of a whack-a-mole approach. You know, you get a call, I need this sidewalk fixed. You went out and you spent what money you could to fix that spot. It's not very effective, obviously. And so we decided in 2015 to invest in a sidewalk master plan. That sidewalk master plan included a sidewalk inventory process. The consultant walked each of our city streets and, using a hand paper plan, went out and gave good and poor rankings for entire blocks. So it's not very detailed in terms of telling us, you know, this corner needs to be addressed, but it gave us a sense of, okay, this is a corridor we need to address. From that, the plan developed priority corridors for Birmingham's 23 communities. And it divided those priority projects into short, medium, and long-term projects. Short-term were supposed to be completed in 0 to 5 years, and then 5 to 10, and then 10 plus years. However, there are a number of challenges with that left us with. So the first is, of course, inadequate funding to implement. We just never fully funded the kind of projects that we needed in order to capitalize on this sidewalk inventory and this master plan that we developed. And so that leads to slow project development. A good example is that we ended up applying for an STTBH grant in order to implement year one of our sidewalk maintenance plan. But between all of the red tape of federal grants like that, that project is scheduled to start in 2025. So we're way behind from where we actually started this project. The other issue we had was no one was managing the data. The city of Birmingham's GIS system, while decent in terms of communicating to the public, was designed mostly for addressing purposes. So we didn't really have a GIS team that could take this data and then help the planning department and the transportation department really delve into it and say, okay, here's your problem, here's your corridor. And knowing who was in charge of that data sometimes is hard to. We're still working through some of that issues. As I said, this was a street by street, boots on the ground effort. That it was a very labor intensive process. The inventory itself took 3 years to conduct. And that becomes a big problem, again, in terms of project development. And infrastructure is dynamic. You know, so what we identified in 2015 as a priority corridor may no longer be a priority corridor because it's deteriorated at a faster rate in another location. So it really makes the data that we acquired less applicable to our day-to-day initiatives. The most interesting part of the challenge is that I don't think in our department we expect reliability concerns. As we started to use this data and move forward, our office of the city attorney became very concerned. One of the easy ways to defend the city in a lawsuit around sidewalks is that we just didn't have eyes on it. We have such large infrastructure that, you know, we just weren't aware of that specific problem. But if you have a data and a plan set, that becomes a more challenging defense. The office of the city attorney had to sharpen their defense tactics. I can't really speak to the specifics of how they've sharpened that. So if you have questions about that, I would refer to that to our office of the city attorney. But it was an interesting challenge that we hadn't really thought about when we first started these efforts to develop a sidewalk infrastructure plan. So going forward in the city of Birmingham, where are we now? So we're going to continue to use this existing data as well as old inventories, 311 fix, and try from there to prioritize our limited funds into projects that we can deliver, short, small projects, mostly in the $100,000, $150,000 range that we can implement every year rather than waiting to match that to a larger federal grant. We're also coming up with more creative project delivery processes. 2 examples of that. One is the City of Birmingham Transportation Department is beginning to develop standards to hold developers when they redevelop a property and say, you have to fix this sidewalk or you have to install this sidewalk as part of their site plan. So we're in the process of really firming out what that policy looks like. But another example is one that we just started this year with our street resurfacing projects, which tend to get a little more priority funding wise than sidewalks. We were mentioned that, you know, we have concrete in those contracts in order to improve ADA curb ramps, which we're required to do. So what we have started doing is expanding the concrete package in our resurfacing packages and addressing major sidewalk concerns on streets that we're resurfacing. So that's a new creative way that we are trying to deliver sidewalk projects that we know we need to get done. And finally, we are looking at new asset management techniques and technology. Obviously, like I said, the labor intensive boots on the ground method was a good start, but not really effective when you consider the rate of deterioration in the city of Birmingham. We're really starting this right now with pavement management. We are about to start a contract with RAS later this year to inventory all of our street networks and help to prioritize them for paving. They have an ability to do 360-degree photographic scans as they're driving along doing their pavement scans that could be used for sidewalk inventory. We are still working through that to decide if that's the technology we want or if there's another one, but we need to get to a point where we can do inventories at a quicker pace and help to prioritize how we're going to implement our sidewalk funds. So with that, I will turn that back over.
Thank you so much, Colin. Really interesting perspective there from Birmingham. We're going to go ahead and transition to our final panelist before we get into our Q&A. So queue up those questions, send them in when you have them. We'll turn the floor over now to Mark Hallenbeck to talk about some of the research happening up in Washington. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to have this chat. So I'm going to talk about a data standard that's called Open Sidewalks. It is a standard that we are working on promoting as part of a large project that we call the Transportation Data Equity Initiative. And our project is largely funded by US DOT and their wonderful ITS for US program. If you're not familiar with that, I would really suggest you take a look at it. The link to ITS US is at the bottom of this slide. It's also on the last slide of this presentation. Our particular team, there are 4 teams. Ours is working on all of these are working on mobility for people with disabilities. That's the driving force. Our lead is Dr. Anat Kosby, who leads the Tasker Center for Accessible Technology at the University of Washington. The core of our problem associated with sidewalks is that sidewalk data, for the most part, is not really available in the modern electronic mapping world. If you go to a Google, if you go to Apple, if you go to any of your favorite navigation software, it will tell you where to go as a pedestrian. What most of those maps think of is they think of you as a very slow-moving car. And if they know there's a path, hey, that's great. Often they don't know much about the details of the path. So in this particular example, this is going from the university's original light rail station up to the electrical engineering building, and it'll give you multiple paths. What it doesn't tell you is that the one path is all gravel. Another path has a series of stairs, and there was, at the time we made this graphic, a big section of construction going on. Now, if you're Mark and you're perfectly capable of walking upstairs and you're happy to walk on gravel, that's perfectly useful information. But if you have particular needs, you are in a wheelchair, you're pushing a stroller, or my grandchildren in strollers, suddenly that bank of 24 stairs is quite a barrier, and you're not necessarily sure you want to go about it. And depending on which stroller I took, I may or may not be able to go up that path. And so this information is not only not nearly as useful, it can actually be harmful. It can drop me in places or send me down paths that are actually difficult for me to recover from. As an individual, this is a bad thing. As a planner, I have no information to be able to make the decisions you just heard about that the city of Birmingham is wrestling with right now. Where do I put my money? How do I put it in? How do I prioritize? And our project, the Transportation Data Equity Initiative, and in specifics, the Open Sidewalks Data Standard, are designed to really help that process. And we do that by saying we want a standardized way to collect routable transportation information. We want that information to be detailed and connected. That is, most of the inventories you heard about are asset management databases. They have a geographic portion, and the geographic portions are not directly connected. So you don't know that I can go from this sidewalk to that sidewalk, or I have a curb ramp at this particular location that is connected to the sidewalk that leads me down to the street, and I can cross the street at those particular points. So as you start to think about collecting your sidewalk data, we really encourage you to use the Open Sidewalks data standard as a way of building the underlying network to which you attach all that wonderful inventory data. And in doing so, we want to make sure that you collect that inventory data in objective fashion, and that you can use that, therefore, to manage the information that you have. So when we say objective information, what we don't want you to say is this is accessible or it's not accessible. And the reason is because what's accessible to me may not be accessible to you. Even someone in a wheelchair, some people in wheelchairs are very happy to hop curbs. Other people want nothing to do with hopping curbs. Whether the height of your wheelchair tells you whether a side slope is actually dangerous to you, you can tip over, or whether it's not a problem to you. So we want not just someone to say this is an accessible sidewalk or this isn't an accessible sidewalk. We want you to be able to say there is a curb ramp. It is 4 feet wide. There are tactile delineators on it. So in case you are a blind individual, you can understand that there is something here that you need to be aware of. In that realm, Open Sidewalks is what an old man like me calls a link node network, or if you're a modern computer scientist, it is a graph network. That is, you want it to be a transportation network, not just an inventory. When you do that, you have the opportunity to build routing into the system. So this is a display of something we have built to take advantage of the Open Sidewalks data network. It is a personalized routing application called Access Map, and it is functional wherever anyone has collected openly published Open Sidewalks data. And it allows you to say something about who you are and what you need as a pedestrian. So in this case, I've said, hey, I need curb ramps and there's steep slopes. I can't go up those. I only want to cross the street when there, in fact, there's a traffic signal there that I can take advantage of. And I really want crosswalks. And the navigation then takes me from my starting point A to my destination B in a roundabout manner. But it takes me in that roundabout manner because there are hills I can't traverse. And so this is the longer but flatter direction. It takes advantage of the fact that I know where the crosswalks are and I know where the curb ramps happen to be. And therefore, as an individual, I get personalized routing information because the inventory data collected and supplied in a routable network allows me to actually use that information for those purposes. Once you have that information, then in my world as a transportation data person, the world opens up. So the individual person is what drives our particular project. But if I want to improve that, I have to work in the environment of the city of Birmingham or any other county or city agency. So this is what we call a Walkshed graphic. In this case, I've dropped a grocery store. That's this big circle here, just below the middle of the graph, a little bit to the right. And I have said, how far can someone walk in 15 minutes or roll in 15 minutes? And the difference between the black lines and the red lines, or the red lines allow a normative individual, myself, to be able to walk, meaning I would like to have a sidewalk and I'm willing to cross streets. The black lines show you where someone who requires curb ramps can go. Therefore, the difference is highly visible on where people can go or can't go based on the individual characteristics of those people. When you overlay parcel level census data on top of this, you suddenly have the ability to say, wow, not only is this segment missing these attributes, because look, the black line won't go there, but the red line does. What happens at that intersection? Oh, look, there's no curb ramp. I could say, if I add that curb ramp, how many more people can walk to the grocery store or roll to the grocery store? And now I have a way of actually prioritizing where my particular improvements are. The other thing that we can really see is if you're a planner, you often say, hey, everybody can walk. How many people can walk to this transit stop? Well, it's a quarter mile, it's a half mile. And we draw a big circle in GIS because drawing circles in GIS is really easy. When you actually place walk sheds on top of the map and say, this is where people can actually walk within a 10-minute walk shed, which is, by the way, about how far people will how long it takes people to go 10 minutes. Suddenly you see that, wow, that half-mile circle doesn't do nearly justice to who can actually walk to the 2 yellow lines right here, which are our bus stops to the bus rapid transit line here in Bellevue. And suddenly I start to understand who really does have access to transit stops, who really does have access to grocery stores or parks or health facilities, which allows the city of Birmingham to do those kinds of prioritizations. Hey, you want safe routes to schools? Who can actually walk to your school? How far are you willing to let them walk? What attributes do you want to have in your network in order to enable everyone to get to your street? Open Sidewalks is specifically designed to take that base inventory data, use it in order to be able to route individuals in order to understand the importance of particular features, who can walk, where they need to walk, and understanding not just the average individual, Mark, I like to think I'm normal, right, to people who have particular needs, which is really important as we move forward. So you're interested in this, by all means, please contact us. Here's the contact list. Anat Cosby, again, is our lead. I'm just the program manager as part of this. Or if you get into the US DOT side, Kate Hartman is our contractor representative, and Elena Slachenko is the primary lead. And so you'll see the websites here, both for the Transit Equity Initiative, that's at the very bottom, or US DOT. And at that point, I will turn this back to our wonderful moderator, and we will take questions, I think.
Thank you so much. Yeah, if the panel can all come back, we're ready to enter our Q&A phase. We've got exactly 23 minutes by my clock, so perfect. We're not going to get to every question. There were so many, but we did our best to prioritize and collapse some of the themes and topics together. So I hope we'll touch on a lot of the issues that you all are wondering about. Louise Lockett is back and will help me moderate this Q&A. So we'll just kind of go back and forth. The first questions that I'd like to start with are actually some clarifying questions for Aaron, Dr. Dannenberg, and Dr. Kraft for their work where we started. How did you determine, I will start here, how did you determine the corridors that you were going to explore with some of the inventories? And I realized that you were looking at inventories that maybe existed, so it might be a question of why did they pick those corridors, but this is a bigger picture question about how do we prioritize the corridors if we can't collect data everywhere? Could you get into some of that issue, if you don't mind?
Sure. Since this study was really focusing on the methodology of inventories, what the inventories covered was really more about the city and their specific needs. And the ones that we really looked at for the 21 cities are ones that did look at the entire city and all of their corridors, just because it needs to be comprehensive, kind of as Colin was saying, is if you only do one part of your city, that's great for that part of the city, but it doesn't reduce liability or improve the network as a whole for everyone else. So we were looking at ones that are really trying to be holistic in their connectivity.
Got it. And another clarifying question, when you looked across these inventories, how many of them would you say took into account issues that were related to the needs of blind or visually impaired pedestrians, the presence of, say, accessible pedestrian signals, these types of features that maybe were identified and then included in the inventory itself?
Unfortunately, I don't really recall any of them specifically calling that out as a factor. And it's a really good point, because that's obviously a critical part of it, because we need our communities to be accessible for everybody, not just those who are able-bodied. And that's a really good point. I mean, some cities do separate safety assessments, and that might come up a little bit more there. But unfortunately, in terms of just the inventory and the condition assessments, that wasn't really a significant factor.
It must be difficult to go out, we're focused on sidewalk inventories. There's a temptation to collect every bit of data you can find, but it also can be a slippery slope. You can only collect so much if you really want to focus on sidewalks, I'm assuming.
That's exactly right. I mean, some of it does get to it tangentially in terms of when you're looking at, tree roots tearing up sidewalk and the angles at which the panels are there, or how much distance there is. that does tangentially get to some of the needs of those who are less able. But again, there hasn't been that specific focus, at least not that I saw. Andy, Kate, please feel free to jump in if I'm not remembering something.
Yeah, I think with limited resources, kind of the first step is just know where are they present or absent or disconnected. And then clearly the equity and usability of that. That's why Mark's work is so important, trying to get more of that level of detail access for everybody.
Thanks. We're going to move to our next question. For folks looking to actually, conduct inventories of their own, can you give us or elaborate on the best software and or apps that folks can use to actually conduct these inventories in their communities?
Sure. So I can bring up a couple that we found often. I don't want to particularly endorse one or the other, just because it's going to really be based off of what your community's needs and wants are. But Esri provides, and I provided an answer in the chat, and I can put it in the general chat. But Esri has a collection tool that kind of links up with like some of the GIS services that they offer, that allows you to put in all of the really what you're walking and allows you to map it and produce publicly and privately accessible GIS maps online. There is also a tool called iAuditor that does similar things, just on a slightly different software system. Yeah, that's really, those were the two main ones that came up. Otherwise, some cities just did paper copies of, they came up with their own questionnaire based off of their own interests and targets. But those were the two primary collection apps that we found, and that places seem to be very happy with.
Yeah, I don't think we're ready to, endorse any particular approach. I think in the practical guide, we can list some of the ones we found, but that would be a whole study in itself to see which ones are best and which ones have advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah, those are great. I wanted to shift the discussion a bit to a topic that came up in numerous different ways during the questions we received about the role that the community can play in this process. And I actually wanted to see if I could start with Colin here, because one person asked specifically about Birmingham, but then Mark, I'd love to hear your feedback and the rest of the team as well. What role do community members, possibly organizations within the Birmingham community play in pushing for more sidewalks, certainly, but conducting the inventories themselves? Do they get involved in that process? We can start there and then maybe ask, I'd love Mark to weigh in on that too, to see if there's an opportunity for folks, organizations, advocacy groups to get involved in this.
Sure. In terms of the inventory process itself, not really. We really were relying on the engineering firm to provide us, good poor ratings and use that as empirical data. When it came to using that, because we did it as a master plan component, there was a big community involvement portion in that, in terms of identifying our corridors that we wanted to focus our funding on, figuring out where are people walking, and because each community had a set of priorities. So each community was involved in that process of what corridors would you like to see? Does that line up with where there is need for improvements? We do get a lot of neighborhood associations campaigning for new sidewalks, which is very challenging. We want to expand our network, but at the same time, we have to balance that because we have more infrastructure than we can maintain at the moment, to be completely honest, in terms of the available resources. So we have to strike that balancing act of where do we do that investment. There's a lot of neighborhood push for those kind of things. And then, of course, we have a very active community in our 311 C-Click-Fix environment that keeps us abreast of where there's a lot of requests in this area. Okay, we know we need to focus over there.
The thing I will add specifically to Open Sidewalks is Open Sidewalks was designed to be directly compatible with OpenStreetMap, and OpenStreetMap is community driven. As a matter of fact, the Open Sidewalks data standard seems to be overtaking the original version of how you put sidewalks into OpenStreetMap. In the original version of sidewalks, StreetMap, sidewalks were tagged in OpenStreetMap as an attribute of the street. Now you will see that many communities are starting to draw the sidewalk lines as their own individual entities in OpenStreetMap. That's exactly where we want people to go. And there's a little more to the standard than just that, but doing that is great. So the the fact that it is essentially an OpenStreetMap standard or a version thereof of the OpenStreetMap standard, it really encourages the ability for advocates, local community members to in fact go out and do this. Much of the early work for Open Sidewalks, which was done before the big US DOT project, actually was funded under Microsoft and their ADA disability work. And they actually had a program where you would have again, led by Dr. Cosby, they would organize it. Cities would bring groups of people who were volunteers in order to do mapathons, who would map the various parts of the city, bring that data in. And as you just heard, different groups have very different emphases. One group had to put in every tree they could find. Other groups really care about where, exactly how the curb ramps are designed. In Minnesota, they care about indoor routing because of the Skybridge system. In Seattle, we care an awful lot about slope. So Open Sidewalks, by being an open standard and by being able to enter it directly into OpenStreetMap, is in fact encouraging community groups, advocacy groups, in order to join the process to bring data in. That's great for the basics. It really starts to fail when you want really detailed inventory data. If you want quarter-inch displacement, the community groups are not the right people to do that. But if you want a good network, if you want to know where the major problems are because of, a 4-inch displacement because of trees, community groups are really good at that kind of thing because they care about the details. They're also really good at vetting data that somebody else has collected because they'll tell you where things are wrong. So yeah, community groups are a big part of this, and yes, look to leverage them to the greatest extent possible.
Yeah, if I could add, I think advocacy groups probably have the most impact. And you heard Colin say how few resources they have. If the advocacy groups can be vocal and get more resources, then that can help move everything forward.
Thank you.
Thanks. Our next question is probably more for Aaron and team and perhaps Mark as well, but certainly open. How do these methods differ from those recording PCI or pavement condition index for road surfaces between the curbs? Measuring and maintaining PCI seems to be a standard practice for municipalities, and even a requirement to maintain a minimum PCI. Is there anything like a sidewalk condition index standard?
Unfortunately, there isn't. That is a great idea and would be a lovely thing, but unfortunately, it just doesn't exist. And so that's why, answering this question is really hard in that it's up to your municipality as to, the only real standards that exist, I'd say, are the ADA guidelines and the ADA standards, about how wide the sidewalk can be, about what level of angle it can have, and about the gaps that it can exist in terms of, one piece to another. But apart from that, unfortunately, this is one of the things that we saw, is that there just aren't these standards that exist, which is kind of how we're in this problem of, everyone needing to really start at the beginning and do these inventories to understand where they actually are and where they need to dedicate their resources. So yeah, creating that kind of index would be fantastic. And it is a great future step.
Yeah, I will piggyback on that. I think that that's actually a critical step going forward. I mean, PCI, the advent of PCI and its use in municipal planning has really helped with our paving projects. And I mean, that's what we're doing now, but it's hard to prioritize a large sidewalk network when it's red or green,
And one person doing the survey has a slightly different version of what's red versus what's green.
Exactly.
And to get at that is the kind of a little bit, if I want to say, concern with community involvement, is it's about the level of kind of internal resources that you have to provide a level of consistency or training. When you're using a collection app, or even if you're just doing it on a piece of paper and you have standardized questions, that can be really helpful. But kind of getting everyone on the same page of what is, a significant versus a minor versus a major. ADA only provides so much guidance on that. And so that does require some conversation among city leadership about what exactly you want and what's going to be acceptable to you and your community, with the ADA, again, being kind of that minimum threshold. When it comes to conducting a basic inventory of is there a sidewalk where or not, definitely a lot easier to involve community then and to have volunteers, because then it's a simple yes or no, like, is there a sidewalk here? Even for some of the more basic things, like, is the sidewalk 5 feet across? which is a standard for ADA, that can also be really easily accessible for volunteers as well. So,
And just to pitch in, if you can make that information available to and usable, even at that very base level, there is a sidewalk, there isn't a sidewalk. If you can do it with, that's kind of the next level. Are there major problems, you know, in discontinuities? Where are the curb ramps? That's kind of the base of, and when you can put that out there, and then people have the ability to interact with that, that helps build the public support for being able to then do the next level of prioritization, which is actually understanding the true condition, being able to do all the things the pavement community has now been doing for the last 50 years, which is developing deterioration curves, creating prioritization mechanisms. You know, they have the indices, PCI is one, there are multiple others on exactly how you calculate these, but even underneath the PCI index, there's a whole lot of detailed LiDAR data nowadays that supports that. But it's in large part that drives the prioritization process. So this first step is, hey, if we actually know where the sidewalks are, if we actually know where the major features are, that at least gets us down the road and lets us have rational conversation. So it's definitely not where you want to end up, but it's a great starting point.
Yeah. And this was touched on a couple of times, but some version of this question came in more than any of the others, I think, and it is maybe, and Colin, I'd like to start with you here, but let's have everyone weigh in. It's an important topic. Does conducting sidewalk inventories and identifying these gaps pose a liability issue for municipalities? I think it's worth spending some time talking about this.
Yeah, that was, like I said, that was the thing that actually surprised us as just the planning engineering practitioners in the building when our law department was like, wait a minute, you know, this is a liability concern. And I think that is still an open challenge that, as I said, I mean, I'm not privy to the actions that our attorney's office are taking to address that. But it is a challenge when your practices can be really easy to say, well, we're going to dismiss this lawsuit because the city didn't know about it. That gets challenging when you start collecting the data to actually go out and say, we're going to fix that. And what's the new strategy for that? I think it is something that any city trying to go into a sidewalk inventory needs to have that conversation with their attorney office.
As an old line traffic engineer, and I'm not a lawyer, so remember, I'm a traffic engineer speaking, to take everything with huge grains of salt. This is liability is something that the traffic engineering world has dealt with forever and ever and ever. And the good news from a legal defense, if not necessarily otherwise, if you have a system, the law acknowledges that we cannot solve all problems because there isn't enough money. If you have a system that when you understand where things are, if you have a prioritization mechanism that has been publicly reviewed and adopted, and you are dealing with that, that's part of your ADA transition plan. This is how we're going to get there. And it may take us a while to get there, but we have a process. Yes, we know that's there, but we're fixing these 17 other places that are even worse. That is by far a better legal defense on the liability side than we just didn't know anything about it. So that's been the traffic engineer's view of how you deal with that liability, because they've had to deal with liability of, you know, they built this road in 1823 and the curve doesn't fit, but, you know, hey, I know it's not standards, but it was built in, you know, and whatever, we have to tear down this, you know, 50-story office tower in order to make that curb meet modern standards. So I think the process as you go to the inventory is, it's not just that you can't stop there. You have to say, now we need a prioritization system and we're going to talk to the public about how we do the prioritization system. And again, those are really good discussions to have, but it also gives you a better legal basis in order to be able to respond to those things.
So as a follow-up to that, I think you're right. And that is part of the conversation we've been having with our city attorney's office to change the approach of how they handle that. One of the challenges that they're concerned about is, especially, you know, you pointed out, you need a plan, but that plan has to have backing and you have to be actually working on this. And part of the challenge that we have is that we don't have funding dedicated to these active projects. So you get stuck in well, we're going to get to that in 4 or 5 years, and the judge going, that's not a reasonable time frame. And so that's part of the discussion that we have to, it is a multifaceted approach that has to be addressed.
Yeah, I think you brought up something, or started to touch on something that we received multiple questions about in terms of funding. and funding conducting inventories. So I think it's important both for staff and advocates to be able to ask for the right kind of dollar amount. But do you have any thoughts on the best resources for obtaining funding, particularly for smaller municipalities to do inventories? And what are we talking about in terms of costs for labor, materials, et cetera, to conduct an inventory like these?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So when it comes to best ways of getting resources, really working, if you have advocates in your community, the ADA is going to kind of be your best way of leveraging the local community leaders to care about this. There have been some fairly significant lawsuits around ADA. I can, if you type in Los Angeles ADA lawsuit, you will find one that resulted in an 8-figure payout by the city. And so utilizing that and saying, we want to work with you. We understand that the city doesn't have the resources at the moment to fix it all right now, but getting them to start working on some kind of plan to get there with the artillery of a potential ADA lawsuit is usually a pretty good way of getting their attention and saying, like, hey, we understand the situation, but this is also the reality, and this is a significant need. Yeah, Colin, please.
Can I add to that too? I will say, as a city in the Deep South where walkability and multimodal is kind of a challenge, for peer cities like that, tie it to your paving. And what I mean by that is two things. I mean, we are doing pavement inventories and pavement condition index. Well, a lot of those firms now, they have camera imaging and go, well, we can do your sidewalk inventory in that process. So you can tie that into a city that's saying we need to focus on paving. You can sneak sidewalk inventories in that process. And the same thing in implementation. I was alluding to this. When we pave our streets, we are required by ADA. If we touch a curb, we have to update the curb ramp. That means that you have a contract subcontractor. So if you can start to stretch your budget and say, well, we're just going to add a little more concrete in this paving contract, knowing that these sidewalk corridors where we're paving can be addressed, it's a good way to start to address sidewalks in areas where maybe sidewalks aren't a priority.
Also, just piggybacking off of that, some places as kind of like the interim step when they already have capital projects already set, if like you're saying, if you already have your capital outlay for repairing X street and you see that there's sidewalks, you can often as not lump in a little bit extra to get that done. Now, in an ideal world, there will be separated funding and dedicated budget items to sidewalks, but you have to make do with sometimes what reality actually is.
I'll close out here with this one. We maybe just have a minute or two for responses. It started with a question to Colin. I'd like to ask it, maybe broaden it out a little bit more. Have you found that the state DOT, Alabama DOT, has been able to be a partner with you on this process? Obviously, a lot of communities have state-owned roads, and so it seems like there's collaboration needed there. But there were bigger questions, other questions about what's the role for state DOTs in this process? What's the role for health departments, county, local health departments, state health departments, and kind of supporting this work? We can start there with you, Colin, and then maybe if others have ideas. Yeah,
at this point, quite frankly, no. ALDOT is really focused on moving cars as fast as they can. Birmingham does have a number of state routes that run through, and there's some debate about, again, who's responsible for those sidewalks. There's some old laws on the books that say that everything beyond the curb on a state route is the local DOT's responsibility, not the state DOT's responsibility. So we are having more conversations about that with our state DOT, but they really have not been a huge partner in that.
Yeah.
I'll jump in here and say that this is my favorite teaching phrase is "it depends" is the answer to everything in transportation. And I think when you talk state DOTs, it depends is a huge answer. If you're in a state that has very heavy concentrations of large urban areas, walkability, complete streets, anywhere that the phrase complete streets, North Carolina is a big complete street state, right? So if you were to talk to North Carolina DOT, they're going to be far more receptive to this concept than if you were to go to, well, what you've just heard, Alabama or Wyoming, a place where walkability, because of the the nature of the urban design or lack of an urban design really downplays people having a huge population that cares about that. But if you're in a state that has large populations that care about those things, you'll find the State Department of Transportation much more interested in it. So that just be aware that you need to be aware anytime people care about complete streets and multimodal, then they're going to be on your side. And if you're in a geographic area that doesn't care about those things, they're going to be far less on your side.
If I can just add real quick, health departments certainly can be strong advocates for getting more sidewalks, but they certainly do not have the resources to actually build them, but they should be part of the advocacy for them.
Thank you. Lots of roles to play. And I'm sorry we don't have more time to answer questions. There were so many great ones. I do hope you'll follow up with us if we didn't get into your topic of interest, or we can point you in the right direction. We're happy to do that. We are going to post the recording by tomorrow morning, maybe today, if I can get to it. You'll get an email with information about how to access all of that information, the archive, the post-webinar survey, which we've shared in the chat. If you complete that, you'll get your certificate of attendance. So we encourage you to provide your feedback to us. I just want to say a big thanks to our panel and a big thanks to America Walks for helping put this webinar on. We're grateful for that partnership, and we look forward to collaborating again in the future. We hope to see you all next time. Thanks very much, everybody.